Thank you for coming, all of you. I will first talk about the safety for the workers in the projects, and afterwards Helle will talk about consumer safety and food safety. The reason why I think it's relevant that that NanoPack, organizers of NanoPack thought that the occupational aspects of working with nanoparticles were relevant is that, as you can see in the drawing on the right, that's your left, this project uses nanoparticles to bind and load the antimicrobial essential oils that will then be incorporated into plastic foil. And there are some issues in working with nanoparticles that may not apply to working with larger particles in bulk materials. So when we talk about nanoparticles, these are really particles that have one dimension that's between 1 and 100 nanometer in one of the dimensions. So they could be sheets or tubes or just spherical particles. And it doesn't really tell much to talk about 1 to 100 nanometers. But if you talk on the right, look at that's on your right, yeah, the drawing on your right, you can see that in that yellow circle, this is the size of a nanoparticle, and it's really a nanoparticle really in the size of the width of your DNA and many of the organelles inside the cells. And this means that these kind of particles might have some biochemical, physiological effects that we don't usually see when we work with particles, and they may also be able to enter the body. So in NanoPack, the particles chosen were halloysite nanotubes. They're actually naturally occurring, and you can get them out by mining. They're really made of kind of clay, so I mean we all know what clay is, but they are kind of, you can imagine that they are sheets that are rolled up into tubes. The real production is almost maybe more than 50,000 tons, so the production is worldwide rather large. The particles that we've used in NanoPack are the pristine HNTs. These are the ones that are dug out of the ground. They have a length from about 30 nanometers to 1.2 micrometers. So here in pink you can see that we are within the nanoscale. And when we talk particles, we often also talk surface area. You can see that these naturally occurring HNTs have a surface area of about 26 cubic, no not cubic, what do you call that? Square meters per gram. But then we also have a functionalized nanoparticle, and these are the HNTs that have been etched in acid. The length is approximately the same, or at least the range in length is the same as we saw for the pristine HNTs, but their surface area is much, much larger. It's almost 5 times larger. And if you look at the big circles here on the right, you can see that this is because for the pristine nanotubes, we have a lot of larger particles, but for the etched HNTs, we have a lot of smaller particles, and they will altogether have a larger surface area. And this is very relevant when we talk nanoparticles. Then also the pristine HNTs, at least the natural nano that we use, they also have a small fraction that exceeds 5 micrometer in length. And this may pose a health risk. There are only very few, but these have been in some studies associated with development of cancer. So we already here know that we need to handle the particles with care in the occupational setting. So one of the things that you also look at when you evaluate occupational safety is dustiness. And here I've taken this photo of the motorcycle driver in the sand. And this is because when you throw up particles and also sand in air, some will kind of linger around and hang in the air. And the longer the particles actually stay in the air, the higher the potential for exposure when you work with the particles. And you can assess the dustiness parameter in this small rotating drum. It's a standardized method for assessment of dustiness. And this we've done. And here you can see the dustiness potential of the 3 different particles that has been included in NanoPack. The one in the middle, that's the one we're using, the pristine one, the longest particles, and it's actually, its dustiness potential is very low. So when you work with it, not a lot of particles will be suspended in air. But the etched HNT has a very, very high dustiness potential. So if you pour these particles into a container, a lot of it will be released and can stay in the air for a long time. Hence, it has a very high potential for exposure. In the lung, we have this very small part of the lung that's called the alveoli. And this is where we have exchange of oxygen to the blood. When we inhale particles, they can, I hope you may see the text, but it doesn't look. We have some processes that mean you induce the generation of reactive oxygen species, and these can react with all our natural molecules in the body. They can lead to a condition of oxidative stress. The particles can attract some different cell types, for example, the macrophages, that try to actually take up the particles and remove them. But they will also release mediators that attract some inflammatory cells to the lung. Then you have a condition of inflammation that will lead to the generation of reactive oxygen species, and this again can lead to inflammation. So if you have a lot of particles deposited in the lung, you can have a condition of inflammation. You can also have the particles leave the lung into the blood, and you can also have that the inflammatory mediators leave the lung and go to the bloodstream. And this is a condition we don't really want to have. So in this study, we made an animal study, and we looked at the entrance of these cells to the lung, and we also looked at at one of the inflammatory reactions that leads to acute phase response. In the study, we exposed mice to these different particle types, the pristine and the etched HNTs, and then we looked at day 1, 3, and 28 at different parameters. We exposed the animals once to 3 different dose levels of particles, and this corresponds to the mouse staying 2 hours, 5 hours, or 2 days at the occupational exposure limit for kaolinite, that is clay material. And then we looked at lung inflammation, acute phase response, and also if the particles would induce toxicity to our DNA. What we saw was, in this photo you see all the way to your left, you see the vehicle, they just received a little bit of water in the lungs. And then we have the middle, the yellow dots are the pristine HNTs. And then on your right, you have the red dots. These are the etched HNTs. And what we see is that the etched HNTs actually induced inflammation in the lungs. And this were actually, we could see this also after 28 days. So we do have lung inflammation. And we also saw that the etched HNTs induced acute phase response. What we also saw that I've been talking a lot about the surface area of these particles. So if you here on the x-axis, we have the surface area that were deposited by each of our exposures. And on the y-axis, we have the influx of these cells into the lung. And if you look at the black line, you can actually see that the higher the surface area we deposited in the lungs, the higher the inflammatory response. So this is probably not to do with the specific material the particles are made of, but to the surface area we deposited in the lungs. And this we've seen for quite a lot of other particles too. So the effects in mice really say that the etched HNTs induce lung inflammation at a level corresponding to 2 days of exposure of the mice at the occupational exposure limit. And we also know that the etched HNT was the one that had the highest exposure potential because it's had a high dustiness. We also know that none of the HNTs were genotoxic, which is very, very relieving to know, but some of them were above 5 micrometers in length, and this may be a cause of concern. So I think that for working with these particles, we've done some other studies. We know that if we confine the work with the particles in, for example, what do you call it? Dustinate cabinet. a fume hood, and if you use a special what do you call that, gear that inhalation gear that with filters that will filter from the particles from, you can definitely work with these particles. But you need to think safe by design. This means that when you actually work on your particles, you may have toxicity for the particles that you originally had, like our pristine particles, but then we etch them, and this means that we shorten them, which was good because then we don't have any long HNTs. But then etching also increase the inflammatory potential because of the increased surface area and also the dustiness. So if you work with particles in projects like this, I think you really need to take into account what the particles look like and how you modify them when you functionalize them. So thank you, and then Helle will come and tell about the consumer safety, and then afterwards you can give us questions.
All right. So you may wonder what happens to the consumer. Now we have established what happens in the occupational setting. Our task was to perform the regulatory toxicology to protect the consumers. And how to do that is you make a risk assessment first, and then you look at the legal obligations. There's a legal obligation to get an approval of active packagings. It's actually regulated by an EU regulation. And you also have to get an approval of the essential oils because they're used as preservatives. So it's like two things you have to get approval of. The concept is this: you have the nano capsules, and they're loaded with the essential oil, and then they're put inside the polymer. So you have an antimicrobial polymer with the halicides nanocomposites. And then you have these rolled up films that you can use for wrapping fresh meat, bakery products, dairy products, fruit, whatever. And then the essential oils are gradually given off to the food. So what you do in the risk assessment, a risk assessment consists first of a hazard identification, then a hazard characterization, means how large a dose does it take to get the hazard expressed. And also you need an exposure assessment, and then in the end you can make your risk assessment. However, if you can establish that there is no exposure, then you don't need to take into account all the hazards, because then there is no hazard. So exposure of the consumer only occurs if these HNTs migrate from the plastic packaging to the food. And they don't. Our partner Fraunhofer, they have tested the migration under worst case condition, and they have made a measurement with a surfactant solution, 2,000 milligrams per liter surfactant solution, and for 10 days at 60 degrees, and they did not detect any migration of these nanotubes. It's quite challenging to actually detect these nanotubes, because if you just use the ordinary simulants that you use for plastics, it's not going to be of use, because you can't really distinguish these nanoparticles. You have to have them dispersed in order to actually be able to detect them. But if you use this surfactant solution, you can detect whatever particle is in there. And this result is also in agreement with what you find in the literature, both when you make mathematical calculations and what you have seen with this kind of particles before. When you have an active packaging, as I mentioned, you have the obligation to get an approval in the sense of Regulation 450 from 2009. The NanoPack concept is an active packaging. because it gives off substances to the atmosphere, and it is intended to prolong the shelf life by antimicrobial action. And also, if you have something that's given off to the food with a technological function, then it is a food additive. So you actually have two things to take care of here. So you have to make a risk assessment of both the nanotubes and the essential oils, and you have to give that to the Commission, who in turn give it over to EFSA, who is going to give a scientific opinion if they agree with us that this is not a risk for the consumer. The applications that we are preparing is a dossier for the HNTs as a carrier additive to food contact plastics. And since we have shown that the HNTs are non-genotoxic and non-cytotoxic, they're tested by the COMET assay, as Karin said, both pulmonary and systemic in mice. And from the literature, we have 2 30-day oral exposure of mice that show that we have critical effects in liver and lungs, but the no observed adverse effect level is 5 milligrams per kilo body weight per day. That means that this is the dose that the mice can tolerate. So the HNTs, should they get into the stomach anyway, they do not dissolve easily. There might be a slight exposure to aluminum and silica if you should swallow these HNTs, but otherwise they will not dissolve. But anyway, the NOAL is 5 milligram per kilo body weight still per day. So we also had to make separate dossiers for the essential oils. Here it's carbapenem, thymol, and cinnamaldehyde. It could also be other essential oils, but now we have chosen these. And these essential oils are already approved as flavoring constituents. And from that approval, we know that thymol has an ADI of 0.03 milligrams per kilo body weight per day. And that's the same case with carbapenem, whereas cinnamaldehyde has a slightly higher ADI of 0.23 milligrams per kilo body weight per day. And when you have such an acceptable daily intake, you have to look at what food categories can this be distributed on. So we are making calculations when we decide which food categories this should be used in to see that you do not exceed these acceptable daily intakes. In conclusion, we think that the consumers remain safe because the nanotubes are expected to stay put in the plastic matrix once they're incorporated in there. And also, you're not eating the packaging, and you're not getting any HNTs from the food within the packaging. The essential oils will be limited in use, just as they are as flavoring agents. These are substances you know already from commonly used spices like thyme and oregano and cinnamon, and it's not going to be any more than you usually eat. So all in all, we think that this is going to be a safe packaging, and we are going to apply for that in Europe. So thank you very much. So are there any questions to any of these? Well, you have
missed it, but I tested the effect of migration under extreme conditions like temperature-wise, time-wise. But you also take into account that sometimes packaging might be exposed to light. Is non-degrade plastic. Would light have an effect when it comes to operation? Was that taken into account when you started operation?
I have not done that personally, but I think the presentation yesterday on migration. Angela, could you say something about that?
Well, we didn't take this in account, but light doesn't accelerate migration. So the only is when it comes to the environment that it will be degraded, but that was outside the scope of our work. So we only looked in this time frame when the food is packed and stored or treated in the packaging. And these 10 days, 60 degrees, they include very long time storage, more than a year, and also heat, hot fill and those conditions.
It was done under shadow.
Yeah.
Light is not in the regulation for testing food
Yeah, but
migration.
it's not about the relation between like cautious with the way you're testing, because maybe like the product would be exposed to light normally. People do put food on the window of shops.
Plastic does not degrade. Polyethylene does
Not
not
that quickly.
degrade. It takes 100 years
Nothing is
to
like
the
the full product. And then the migration test doesn't cover, you expose the material to conditions, but they never take the light as a parameter for testing.
Yeah. Well, it's usually it does not have an effect on the
Yeah.
Well, mechanical stress, was that tested? If mechanical stress has an effect on the release of
we did it for other nanoparticles, but not for the HNTs.
Again, it comes down to destroying the polymer, and polyethylene is something which is really inert, and that's the problem we have all over the place.
Yeah.
will be here for many, many years after us.
Very good.
But for the consumer of the food in the package, it's going to be intact. So of course you don't, if the packaging is not intact anymore, you would not consume the food anyway. Yeah.
You showed the correlation between the specific surface area and some, let's say, inflammatory effect. Is there a reasoning for that?
Yeah, we see with many particles that when the surface comes into contact with surrounding molecules, it's the contact between the surface and the molecules that really leads to induction of reactive oxygen species. So the more surface you have, the more reactive oxygen species can be generated. And this is really seen for a lot of particles. Of course, you can have specific materials. For example, if you have cadmium particles, they will be toxic in themselves and they will dissolve. But for most insoluble particles, you will see this relationship between surface area and affects inflammation, for example, and generation of reactive oxygen species. So, yeah. And I just want to state once more that when you work with not only nano-sized particles, but all kinds of dust, you really need to control your exposure, because all kind of dust that comes into the lungs can lead to worker effects, and it's not only in the nano-sized particles. So really this is keeping up your occupational hygiene to the highest level possible when you work with particles and dust, and then probably some more when you work with nano-sized particles. But a lot of colorants will also have a large proportion of nano-sized particles. So this is really something that should be applied to the occupational setting all over. Angela?
You said when we etch the particles, so we haven't any long fibers anymore, which is good, but we have more smaller particles which increase the oxidative stress, and so in principle you have, when you cannot remove it fast enough from the lung, you get in this case a risk of cancer in principle. So it's,
Well, I think that we don't know if we could have cancer, and we really don't know if this kind of, I mean, the particles will eventually be removed unless, I mean, you inhale them every day and you start like stacking particles on top of each other. But we really don't know anything about cancer risk for the smaller particles. What we would predict was that if you have deposition of particles in the lungs and you don't control your occupational setting, you will have an increased systemic inflammation, and this could, for example, lead to cardiovascular disease. So you really need to avoid inhaling particles in the work environment, and also keep in mind that these particles are so small that you can't see them. I mean, usually when the picture I showed about the sand, I mean, you can see these particles hanging around in it. There's a haze in the air, but the nanoparticles are so small, and even if they're there, you can't see them. So it does take for really evaluating the occupational setting when you work with these kind of particles. But if you do that, then our studies about exposure shows that if you confine the work with the particles, then they're safe to work with.
Anybody else? No? Thank you.
Thank you for coming.